Bom, muito boa tarde a todos e a todas. Agradeço mais uma vez a vossa presença aqui nas nossas conversas à Terça. É com muito prazer que estamos aqui e hoje temos a apresentação do Gabriel Costa Valença, que foi um premiado dos trabalhos de doutoramento da redeMOV, os prémios anuais da redeMOV, e o Gabriel desenvolveu um trabalho muito interessante sobre a alocação dinâmica do espaço rodoviário em áreas urbanas complexas, as simples estão resolvidas, e portanto parece-me que é um tema que interessará a todos e dou-lhes as boas-vindas e mais uma vez os parabéns a nome da redeMOV e em meu próprio nome. Muito obrigado.
Boa tarde a todos. So I'm going to switch to English simply because I know there are people in the audience that do not speak Portuguese, so I will do this presentation in English if that's not a problem. So before I begin, I would like to say thank you to redeMOV, to the University of Lisbon. Thank you also to Professor Nuno Costa for giving me here the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work I have been developing in the past years. I would also like to thank the audience. So thank you so much for being here, especially in a sunny day that people could have gone to the beach, right? So thank you for choosing to be here. And I hope you liked the presentation and we can have a great discussion afterwards. So the work I'm going to present here is mainly about my PhD thesis that was supervised by Professor Felipe Moura and also Professor Ana Moraes de Sá, that I have been very grateful for of their support during all of these years, and I'm also very happy that now I continue to work with them after my PhD. So the topic is about allocating road space or urban space dynamically over time, and the first message I want to pass to you is that when we think about allocating road space or urban space dynamically, this is not something new in practice. Okay, so just to give you some simple examples, this is a photo that I took when I went to visit Lund in Sweden, and I saw this interesting dynamics that there were children playing, for example, and then I went there 1 month later, and the space was completely changed, right? There was some food courts, people were using the space differently, they were eating, and even the audience changed in using this square, right? While in the first picture you had, for example, children, now you have a more adult public using the space of the square. And we have examples of this also very similar in Lisbon. So this is Avenida Duque d'Ávila, that is the avenue that is near Technical, and actually on the right side of the picture you can see Technical Innovation Center, that at the time that I took the picture was still under construction, right? And so every Thursday and Fridays this street becomes a market, right? And so a space that people use only to move, now people stop, they buy some things in the market, they socialize. So this is just to show you how simple modifications in space can also somehow change the behavior and how people use the space, right? And of course that these examples that I show you here of allocating urban space dynamically, these are very simple examples. And they're very simple for many reasons. One of them is that there is not a dispute in use of space, right? There is a lot of space, and there's not a lot of transportation modes or even a dispute in uses in these types of spaces. Another thing is that these spaces, they are allocated dynamically, but they are allocated dynamically also in a daily basis, right? Not in periods that are more complex, such as peak hours and non-peak hours. And so these, of course, are simple examples, but when we look at cities, and we look how historically cities have been planned, many cities for the automobile, for example, this is not really the case, right? You have a lot of complex areas. And if you think about how infrastructure is designed, usually what is done traditionally, you do traffic counts during peak hours, and then what you will do is you will calculate that infrastructure to support that demand during that peak hour, right? And the problem with that is that, well, during non-peak hour, usually the space is somehow underused, right? And so there is a certain type of inefficiency of the use of space if we think about how the space is used over time. And so the idea of this thesis is to exactly tackle this inefficiency of the use of space, of using these spaces that are underused at a certain moments for different use or different function. And so the main objective of the work is to evaluate correct ways to allocate space dynamically over time, especially in complex and urban areas. And so there is this idea that's this concept that I think is very important here to reinforce, that when I mean complex streets or complex areas, these are spaces that are very limited in space and have a huge dispute in uses. And so it's not that evident the amount of space that should be allocated for transportation mode, for use in these types of areas. And so the research had four main research questions. First of all, what is the difference between the concepts that I propose here in terms of allocating space dynamically in urban areas and also the ones that already exist in the literature, right? How can we allocate road space dynamically? Where and when does this make sense? And can generative AI or other tools be used, for example, to guide decision-making in these more innovative projects that maybe it's not that easy to understand for everyone? So just a brief explanation here. So my thesis had 8 chapters, the first one being the introduction, the last one being the conclusion. And in between, there were 6 chapters that were paper-based. And so although when you do papers, they are like separate entities, the idea here of this thesis was for these papers to have a certain logic and a certain storytelling. And so this is also something that I'll try to convince you here in this presentation. And so the thesis is divided mainly in 2 parts, the literature review and conceptualization, and also the implementation phase. And so going to the first question, that is, okay, what is the difference between what already exists and the concept that I'm trying to propose here? The first step was to, of course, do a literature review, right? And so what we did was a systematic literature review, but incorporating also text mining techniques using R programming. And so there were 2 main objectives here. The first one is to evaluate where more responsive road space allocation solutions, they appeared in the literature, right? And historically, how the concepts evolve over time that influenced these emerging concepts. And so the first thing that was done, we divided the abstracts into 5 and 5-year periods. And we ran an algorithm to calculate the most frequent words within these abstracts. And so just to give you an example of what this could be given, what the results of this. So if we evaluate, for example, so in the left, you can see the words that are most cited in the abstracts of 5 and 5 years. And so from 2006 and 2010, and also 2011, 2015, you have traffic is very relevant in the literature. And something that we notice is also that the word smart starts appearing in the literature from 2011 to 2015. And so if we compare this to 2016, 2020, something very interesting happens. So the word mobility gains more importance than actually the word traffic that loses importance from this period. And the word smart, for example, that appears in 2011 becomes one of the most relevant words from 2016, 2020. And so this was an initial analysis of the literature review to somehow have an idea of the main concept that influenced these more responsive road space allocation solutions. And so the next step was to actually analyze the papers that really made sense about these emerging forms of allocating road space dynamically or intermittently and different types of solutions. And for this, we use another analysis that was a topic modeling that calculates the probability of the words being together. And so the idea here is that these topics, they group words that are very similar within all the documents. And so just to show you an example what this can give, so if we look at topic 1, so you have 6 main topics in the literature, and this was using the full papers. So you can see words such as dynamic, road, space, allocation, but you can also see words such as car, bus, traffic, time, cost. And so from this topic, you can already have a clue that somehow the literature on dynamic road space allocation is very focused on generalized costs, so to optimize traffic performance and to optimize travel times and costs, right? And so this was, of course, an initial analysis of the papers and initial analysis of the reviews of the literature. But one of the main concepts that we got from the literature review when we were, after doing a qualitative analysis, is this concept of dynamic lane allocation. And so the concept of dynamic lane allocation is this idea that a traffic lane can have a different use in a different time of the day. So, for example, one of the most applied here solutions is the dynamic bus lane that can happen in different times. You have also some literature that talks about reversible lanes, so lanes that change directional movements in different times of the day, and also ones that are more related to futuristic scenarios with the interaction between the infrastructure and also autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles. And so when we look at the literature is actually very applied, and most of the literature is very applied in expressways and arterials, and not really in urban areas. It's more related to traffic performance, so it's totally trying to optimize travel time and delays. And of course, that when you look at expressways, maybe the traffic lanes in the architecture of the models, they should be considered. But when you go to urban areas, maybe the adjacent space they should be also considered for these types of solutions. And they are very focused on the bus, automobile, rescue vehicles, and also autonomous vehicles, and excluding, of course, active mobility, for example, walking and cycling. That, of course, in expressways does not make sense, but in urban areas have to be considered. And so from this kind of gap of the literature, I'm going to try to explain what is somehow the contribution of what this thesis tries to propose. And so to do that, I'm going to show this graph. That is, this graph in simple terms, what it demonstrates is, based on the network hierarchy of the city, is the amount of space that is usually dedicated for the functions of mobility and access. So for example, if we get an arterial or a freeway, you would tend to have more space for traffic lanes, right, than spaces for parking that is more related to access. If you go to the other side of the curve, of course you would tend to have more spaces for access, that is parking space, and less space for the movement function that is the traffic lanes. And so when we look at the literature of dynamic lane allocation, it's very focused here on the left side of this curve, right? And there is a problem that when we go to more urban areas, there is certain streets or certain areas in the city that they are very complex to reallocate. And they are complex mainly due to this dilemma of it's not that evident the amount of space that should be allocated for one use or the other. And so we have a very good example here in Lisbon, that is Avenida Almirante Reis. There is an example of a street that is not that evident the amount of space that should be allocated for one mode or the other, right? And so the idea here is that in these complex areas, we could use the space maybe more efficiently if we allocate some uses dynamically. Of course, not necessarily in this street, but in these types of streets, as I will elaborate also in this work. And so going to the second question, so how can we actually allocate space dynamically over time? So there are already some technology that could do that. So let's say that you have a traffic lane and you want to give priority to the bus. And so one thing that you could use is simply LEDs that could be red and could inform the drivers not to use the traffic lane during peak hours, for example. And so during non-peak hours, maybe this traffic could be mixed, buses and cars, or even other or even in other uses. Another possibility could be parking spaces, right? That during the day, let's say that these parking spaces could be allocated for offices, and then when people go back home, or the restaurants or the bars they open, these spaces could be used for restaurants to put tables, to put places where people can sit. And you could use, for example, flexible boiler to ensure the safety between the pedestrians and the cars, or other types of technologies. So, of course, these are just some examples. And there are already many technologies that are already applied in practice that could be used for these types of solutions. So, for example, as I mentioned, the flexible boilers, you could also have the variable message signs that could inform these transitions of uses in different periods of the day or seasons. The LED pavement lighting, as I mentioned, could change color and change the use during the day. And there are also some other technologies being developed. For example, the dynamic streets. There is a technology that is being developed by Professor Carlo Hatti in his lab in MIT. There are these modular pavements that you have a LED in the middle. You could change color. You could also plug in bollards. You could plug in even basketball hoops and stuff like that. And this can change the configuration of space. You have a more reactive one. There is the Starling crossing. There is a LED pavement. And of course, this is a prototype. But the idea here is when pedestrians arrive to cross the street, a crosswalk will appear, and then also we will inform the drivers to stop. And of course, this has to be in very controlled environments. So from these technologies, we went to another step that was, okay, we evaluated already the solutions, but let's evaluate what types of technologies are possible for allocating space dynamically in different periods of the day, right? And so we did another systematic review focusing on the technologies, so focusing on not only the transport demand management technology that I demonstrated to you, but also the sensing technologies, so how to collect data and movements and the uses of space through videos or sensors, etc. The control technologies such as traffic lights that could be control the movements. And so one thing that we notice is that when we think about allocating road space dynamically, this could range in different levels of technology. So it's not necessarily dependent on technology, and what this means is that you could simply use a vertical sign in some cases to inform the users. But you could also, this could also be a solution in a full connectivity environment where you have AVs, where you have the vehicles and the pedestrians all connected with the infrastructure. And so it's not really dependent, but could use technology. And so when we look at the common practice is actually in the lower levels of technology, right? So this is the common practice. You have some examples, few practical examples in levels of technologies that are actually within the priority vehicles. For example, the intermittent bus lanes that have been implemented here. There was a proposal by Professor Viegas and Lu that has been implemented here in the Alameda. And you have also some literature about the futuristic scenarios with the integration also with AVs. And something very interesting is that although the practice in allocating space dynamically is going to lower levels of technology, when we look at the literature is very focused on the opposite direction. And so there is this kind of, so this is also a criticism also to the academia, right? That is going sometimes not looking at the real state of practice and just looking at futuristic scenarios. And so this makes it even more relevant, the work that is being done here that is also looking at lower levels of technology. And so, of course, that all of these ideas and all of these solutions, they are very pretty, they are very nice, and makes us think about these smart urban spaces or responsive urban spaces, but they face many challenges. Right? They face challenges of acceptability, challenges of equity, and maybe they are not current to be implemented in every place, and in which solutions are more suitable, right? And so what we wanted to discover is where and when does this make sense? So we went to this idea, again, about these complex areas, so areas that face the complexity of using space. And to do that, we used, first of all, what we did was to aggregate to calculate some indicators, aggregate some data. So we got the city of Lisbon, we divided it in a grid. We used some data for this, so we used the land use commercial census data. We used the population census data. We also used the general transit feed specification data that is the standard format for public transport. So here what we did was calculate the frequencies of the buses in each bus stop in different times of the day. We also calculated the traffic levels using Google Maps API in different times of the day, and used the OpenStreetMaps to see centrality measures of the morphology of the road network. And so the first thing that we ask is, okay, what is actually a complex space that has this potential for allocating space dynamically? And beside this idea of the mobility and access dilemma that I explained, there is this idea that it's not that evident amount of space that should be allocated for one mode or the other. There are some other factors that contribute. So the first of all is connectivity, right? If you have a place that is very connected to other streets, you tend to attract more trips to that place. And so this is also contributes to this complexity. Another thing is that we try to locate places in the city that were very dense. Because if you have a lot of population, you will also have a lot of people using that street, and this will create more complexity. And one point that is extremely important is diversity of land use. Because if we consider a place that is strictly residential, for example, what will tend to happen is that you tend to have two peaks of demand. So people going to work in the morning and people arriving from work in the afternoon. But if you have a place that is very diverse, what will happen is that you will have different opening and closing hours of restaurants, bars, services, offices, and this will tend to happen that you will tend to have different fluctuations of demand of different types of users, and this is what enables these allocations dynamically. And so we also try to examine places that had at least 1 hour a day, very high levels of traffic within the zones, right? But let's say that you have all of these elements, but public transport does not operate in that street, right? That does not mean that the space is not complex. What it means is that if you have public transport operating there, you will tend to have even more complexity because you will tend to have a dispute between the vehicles and also the public transport. And so in orange, what we consider as complex, in red, we consider as very complex areas to reallocate road space and therefore the potential to allocate space dynamically. And so we use many indicators to calculate these assumptions. I'm not going to go to much details on these indicators. We can talk maybe in the discussion. But the idea here is that we use these indicators and we try to establish some parameters for each of these indicators. And using sensitivity analysis, we try to see the intersection of these indicators that met to identify complex and very complex zones. And so the intersection of all of these indicators within the map is actually the identification of a complex or very complex zone. And in Lisbon, we identified 20 zones that are either complex or very complex. But of course, that this is somehow a screening process of the territory, right? So we do not go here, for example, in the details of which solution does it make sense, what type of streets or local characteristics make sense for these types within these zones. And so for that, we did a second step that was looking in these zones that we identified within the zone, within these criteria, right? And looking up to the streets. And so for that, we invited some experts to a workshop, experts from academia, from local authorities, and also from public transport agencies to identify exactly the criteria for different types of solution of allocating space dynamically. And so here are some photos of this workshop that was held in Technical during the COVID time, so we were very protected here with the masks. And so the methodology of this workshop, so initially what we wanted to do is, first of all, make people get into the topic. So we asked the groups, we divided people in groups, and we asked the groups to think about solutions of dynamic road space allocation, and also some technology that could be used, not thinking really about barriers, more about getting people into the topic. And then afterwards, based on the zones that we identified previously, we created these cards. And these cards are all the streets that are within a zone. And we asked the groups to identify streets that were suitable for different types of dynamic road space allocation. So just to give you an example, in zone 8, that is one of the zones, you have 5 streets that intersect this zone, right? And one of the groups was we identify as the green group, because, well, we identify by colors. And so we asked them which street made more sense for allocating traffic lane in a different time of the day for a bus lane. And so they chose Rua Moraes Soares, right? And we did the same thing for a cycle lane, for example, traffic lane that could become eventually a cycle lane, and a parking space that could also become spaces for commerce, etc. Right? And this, they chose a different street. And so each group had to do that for 4 zones. And then afterwards, we challenged the experts, okay, now think about what were the criteria that you adopted to select each streets and rank these criteria based on different solutions. And one of the conclusions was that, well, different solutions have, of course, different criteria of implementing these in practice. But we also got a lot of things out from this workshop, and mainly during the discussions. And one of them is, when does this make sense, right? And just to give you a brief example here, let's consider, and this is an imaginary example, okay? Let's consider we have Avenida Almirante Reis. And you have the demands of trips of cars in the 24 hours. You have also the demand for buses, and also the demand of cyclists and scooters. And so there will be moments of the day that these demands that we call conflicting. And so what this means is that usually during peak hours, these demands, they are very high for all of the modes. And so the decision here to allocate space dynamically is actually the most challenging decision, because you will tend to take out a space of the car, for example, to allocate to a bus, and this is politically challenging. And so municipalities that have this political will are most likely to implement this solution during these times. But the biggest, I would say, potential for allocating space dynamically is certainly when the demands are complementary. And what this means is that these are moments of the day that you tend to have one demand way higher than the other, right? And so for this example, let's say that the bus has a higher demand than the car, and so this means that maybe the traffic lane could be allocated for the bus. And we also took the conclusion that some streets don't make sense. And some streets, for example, strictly residential, that you really don't have any complexity or any conflicts or any, this does not really make sense to allocate space dynamically. And so the focus here should be actually to retrofit the space, make the space more livable and more safe for children to play and for people to use that space. And so one of the main conclusions that we took also from the workshop is that these types of solutions, they are very context-oriented, right? And one thing that is very important is that the highest potential here to allocate space dynamically is when you identify somehow a problem or you identify somehow a conflict, right? And so let's say that you have, during lunch hour, cars are parking in the travel lane only during that hour, and that's a big problem. And so maybe allocating space dynamically could be a solution for that problem, or it's another possible solution, even besides allocating space statically, right? The complexity also of allocating space dynamically increases if you try to change the urban function. And what I mean by that is that, let's say you have a traffic lane and you wanted to put a market in the traffic lane. So this increases the complexity of doing this and makes it sometimes unviable. Of course, there are some periods that are more complex than others. So maybe allocating space dynamically, as already happens a lot in practice during weekends, is less complex than during working hours. The frequency and number of changes of allocating space also have to be taken into account. So you cannot change the space so much. And also the use of technology. So there is still we still do not understand that much the implications, for example, of public acceptance and even equity implications of using high levels of technologies in the space, and how people will actually adapt to these transitions. And something also interesting is that if you think about the solution, you have to think about the geometry and how the street is actually built, right? So some streets, they change a lot throughout the segment, even in terms of the number of lanes or in terms of the users. And so if you have a unique solution to allocate space dynamically, this may not make sense, right? And different solutions define different levels of complexity, and so this has to be taken into account. And so from this, something that we try to also evaluate is that, okay, can actually these solutions be put in a workshop and people actually get to some kind of consensus, right? And so one thing that we try to evaluate here is, can generative AI or different tools be used to enhance these solutions or make these solutions, the creation of these solutions easier? And so this was a cooperation together with Professor Carlos Azevedo. There's a professor from Technical University of Denmark. And so the idea here is that, let's say you're in a workshop and you have this picture of a street. And so you want to identify possible solutions within with stakeholders. And so let's say you have an AI that will develop many of these solutions, that will create many of these solutions. And so the idea of this work was try to develop this AI. And it's important to mention here that I know that now generative AI is very in the media. But when we started this, ChatGPT was not released yet. So we started this in May 2022. ChatGPT was only in November. So this was very, very innovative at the time. And so just to show you the step-by-steps, what we did was first we got some urban images. We did some filtration. So we filtered the images that make sense, not make sense. And then what we tried to do is, first of all, some alterations in the images. Because the AI algorithm can only detect that a certain object is a car, for example, if you put in the model these alterations, because then in different angles it can identify the same object. And so you use these types of techniques to train the machine learning model. Another thing that we try to do is, okay, let's try to identify the objects within the images initially, and so trying to create an algorithm that could somehow increase or decrease the number of cars, for example. And then what we did was we tried to develop an algorithm that is called a conditional variation autoencoder. There is a machine learning model. The idea is that you incorporate the images and the features, and this will somehow generate a controlled image within the features. But this was, of course, a very experimental work. At the end, we did not get any meaningful results. And this mainly due to many reasons, but one of the reasons is that, well, that we did not have computational power sufficient to run the models. And so we had, for example, 3,000 images, and it took 3 or 4 days to run a model. And we would need way more computational power. And of course, that these kind of things also has lessons. And one of the lessons that at least I took is that who really has the power to train these types of models, right? And so the big companies really have the capacity and have these supercomputers to train these big models of AI. And another thing is also the amount of energy that is used to train these types of generative AI models. And so this should be also a concern in terms of environmental impacts of these models. But all the algorithms is all open source and people can take a look. And so this is also a lesson from this experiment. So in terms of conclusions, so our proposal tries to implement this in complex areas, not only the traffic lanes, but also consider the adjacent space, not only consider the mobility function of the street, but also the mobility and access functions. And the proposal that we take is not really dependent on technology, but it's also can use technology, but not being totally dependent. So in terms of how can we allocate space dynamically, where we have already many technologies, not only developed, but also being developed, these solutions are context-oriented. And I should notice here that we should have, if we try to do these types of solutions, there should be some kind of parsimony. And so not only in terms of the number and frequency of changes, but also the use of technology, the number of transitions and solutions, and how people may accept and may in terms of safety also use these types of solutions, adapt to these types of solutions. So in terms of where and when, so in very complex areas, as I mentioned, so different solutions have different criterias, and you can allocate space dynamically in conflicting and complementary demands. Of course, when you have conflicting, it will be more challenging, but this is also a possibility. And in terms of using generative AI to guide decision-making, well, visualizations can somehow help these understanding of these concepts, but there's still a lot to be done in terms of the impacts of these generative AI models, especially in creativity and how people may misempower people to certain solutions also. So there's still a lot of research to be done. So of course that this was a first work, but there's still a lot to be done. So there's still a lot to be held. So first of all, to examine, for example, how safe are these interactions when you allocate space dynamically? What are the impacts in terms of travel times and delays, not only in the street, but also in the surrounding areas? What are the impacts in terms of the accessibility of the people when you allocate space dynamically of different segments of society? the impacts also in terms of emissions, and how people may accept different types of solutions. So we have been working a little bit on these last two topics. So I would like to acknowledge, before going to the contributions of this work, that this work was within the framework of the Doctor Training Network, also funded by the EIT, that funded a research stay at the Technical University of Denmark, where I had the privilege to work with Professor Carlos Azevedo for 6 months, and with whom I am very grateful for all of his support. And Chapter 7 was mostly developed in DTU and mostly supervised by him during this stay. So in terms of contributions of this thesis, I would say that one contribution would be as the foundational work for a project that we won called Streets for All. There is a FCT project that was funded of approximately 200,000 euros, and so this also gave the opportunity to make more work and build a network within the group to work on this topic. Another thing that I would say that is somehow a contribution is that everything that I did, I tried to make it open source. So I tried to make it reproducible for other researchers to get the work and try to reproduce it. So just to give you an example of the second work that I showed you in terms of the text mining, this is the GitHub page. There's some kind of a Facebook for codes. And so people can go and can download the data set that I used, and they can see everything that I did in terms of the data set. They can also download the codes. So this is in R programming, the raw codes, and so they can reproduce the results. And something that I also did was I also showed everything that I did within a page. So the step-by-step process of every process that I did in each of these steps, reproducing the results of the thesis. And so this is also a contribution. So in terms of publications, Chapter 2 was already published in the International Journal of Information Management Data Insights. Chapter 3 has been published in the Journal of Urban Mobility. Chapter 4 is currently under review in the Journal of Urban Technology. Chapter 5 has been published already in Environment and Planning B. Chapter 6 in the Journal of Urban Design. And Chapter 7, although we did not get any meaningful result, we did a viewpoint afterwards talking about the challenges and opportunities of these generative AI models. And this was also published in the Journal of Urban Mobility. And so one thing, also the work was disseminated through a lot of both national and international conferences. And before I go, I would like to make some kind of a reflection, not talking really about the work, but talking a little bit about the PhD journey. And so when we start the PhD, well, I think we start a lot still with hopes and dreams, right? And so we have a certain kind of a plan, right? And this plan somehow makes a little bit of sense because during our whole life, we had these things went during the plan. So if you somehow study for a discipline and you pass that course, you will go to the next year, right? But the reality of the PhD is very different from that. The reality of the PhD is that you have ups and downs, and you have to still keep going. And there is a certain moment that I would say there is a phrase that every PhD student has heard. There is a good PhD. Exactly, it's a finished PhD. So it's the one that ends. And I know that this sentence somehow has a truth behind it. So it's this idea that you cannot stay forever doing a PhD. But it's also I really don't agree a little bit in some aspects of this sentence. Because first of all, you dedicate a lot of your time and a lot of your efforts to doing a PhD. And so you cannot just deliver it and think it is the end. And not necessarily when you deliver a PhD, it will be a good PhD. And another thing that I think is also important is that this idea of the end. So a PhD is not really the end. And when I think about the impacts that maybe my research had, it's considering that this is not the end. And so a good PhD, in my view, is actually a PhD that allows new beginnings. Is that if I stop now, what other people will maybe do within the work I have developed. And so I have, in this year and a half since I finished my PhD, I have been very lucky to have amazing people working by my side. And so these are the pictures of some of my master students that I am very happy to co-supervise together with other colleagues, and that have continued the work that somehow I started within my PhD. And so with that, I would like to also thank all the institutions that have contributed to my work, and thank you very much. And I'm now open for questions and discussions. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Gabriel.
Yeah.
Em tempo, já coloco à plateia. Coloco à plateia se alguém tem alguma questão a colocar ao Gabriel, para aproveitar.
And thanks for the presentation and congratulations again. Besides the technical difficulties, what would you say are the main barriers? Imagine you find a nice place, and you have a great idea about how to change type of use.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say are the main barriers for having it actually deployed on the ground? Because I found many on my case with the intermittent bus lane.
So thank you, Professor, for your question, and also I would like to say that you had also a great influence in this thesis, also with the intermittent bus lanes, and I studied it a lot. I would say that it also depends of the solution, and it depends of the place, right? And so different solutions will have different barriers. What I would say is that there are some solutions that may be more viable than others, and I'll give you an example. For example, allocating space dynamically for a bus in a bus lane may be one of the solutions that is more viable because it's actually a controlled environment. And so it's a controlled environment because you have bus drivers that could be trained for that, right? You have also drivers of motorized vehicles that are already familiar with sharing the lane with the bus, I would say. But let's say that I want during peak hours to take a traffic lane and put a cycle lane, right? And so there is a big challenge in terms, first of all, of safety, right? That you would not have this with the bus in the car. You have, of course, safety, but you do not put the vulnerable users, the difference in speeds, for example, of cars and the bike. And so it depends a lot of the solution, I would say, and what you're trying to do and the time of the period, the times. Something that I would say also in terms of practice is not really the costs. It could be the costs, but is also in terms of defining the framework, the legal framework, for example, of the governance behind of defining that space will be like that during a certain hour or during a certain time, during all of the days, or even if you use a higher level of technologies to adapt that constantly with demands of or whatever, this would increase even more the implementation of the complexities of implementation. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't know if you wanted to go. It was in this direction, but
I wanted to make a little provocation.
Yes, of course.
All of what you said, I think, is right.
Yeah.
But I feel in more recent times a very strong increase of the sense of entitlement, of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Like this function used to be for this purpose, and I've been using it, so I have the right to continue using it. And I don't care about common good or whatever, because I have this right. And this is being, I feel, exacerbated, aggravated with social media and all that.
Yeah.
So it's possibly, I would say today, the decisive, the strongest factor against any type of change, dynamic or not dynamic,
Yeah, exactly.
is this notion of entitlement, I would say habit of using, as a form of quasi-ownership.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that?
No, I actually agree with that, because just to give you some there is a very interesting work from some, I don't remember the authors, but they published a paper in Nature. And what they did was they got people from polarized views. So they got people from the extreme right and people from the extreme left, for example. They put in the same room, and then they used the generative AI model to create a street and say, okay, this will be the future. What do you think about this? And they managed to get into a consensus because they didn't try to change the opinion of people. So the people that were climate skeptics, for example, the people that were extreme right or extreme, they didn't say that you are wrong. What they said was, this is a solution here of the street. And then both publics, they got into a consensus because they didn't try to change what people believe in, but they tried to show the tangible benefits on a daily basis. And I think this should be the policy strategies, is to try to show the policy, the benefits on a daily basis, and not really, for example, putting, so we talk a lot about, for example, environmental, let's say, reduce CO2 emissions, etc. This could be the objective of the policy, but this should not be communicated to the people. What you should communicate to the people is what are the benefits that you have in a daily basis for your travels or for your, and this is the way that I think is the better way to convince of any solution that you could have. But there's still a lot to be done.
By doing that with their own street.
Yeah, yeah. It could be a challenge.
I agree with you with the method.
Yeah.
But in your example, you did not have any dimension of ownership. It was an abstract street.
Yeah, it's an abstract. Exactly.
It is my street.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I don't think I can. But thank you, Professor.
Any other question? Please. Also, one small question is related with the policy, the policers that will agree or not with the change and the acceptance of the policy side of approving and discussing that changings on the street in my own city, taking in account the example of Professor Viegas.
So, sorry,
the question is the acceptance from the public for the government of the city of changing, because you gave some examples that are very rough discussion about to use, for instance, the Almirante Reis street, and that is very, very important for the politicians that want to decide and want to provide next election, and so what they deal with that.
Okay, so I think the strategy should be also to be based on, for example, data, right? You should do a characterization of the streets, and then if you do, for example, analysis of micro simulation, or let's say other types of simulations to measure the impacts that certain solution could have in that street, this could be some way to try to convince the politicians to go forward or not in a certain type of solution, right? And this somehow is what also happened to Avenida Almirante Reis when they showed the bike counts and saw that when the bikes actually went up, when people were saying that it didn't go up, and so you can actually argue somehow with the politics. But this is for sure a challenge. And I think for any solution, not only allocating space dynamically, is for changing the space, as Professor Viegas well mentioned. Yes.
Not in my backyard.
Yes, exactly.
Ok. Mais alguma questão queiram colocar? Não? Então. Okay.
Yes.
Not about the thesis, because unfortunately I had to arrive too late, so I could not listen to your presentation. But I want to comment on your last comment.
Okay.
about the PhD being good if it ends, or maybe this is not necessarily good. And I disagree, because there is no PhD that ends and it's not good. That's why there is a jury. So the minimum of a PhD is being good. Can be exceptional, but minimum is good for the students that are in the room, okay?
Yes, okay. It was not my intention to...
And thank you.
Yes, it was more to change the words and make...
Okay.
But yes. But
Playing with the words sometimes is dangerous,
yes.
okay?
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Bom, agradecer-te.
Obrigado.
Obrigadíssimo.
Muito obrigado.
E para o mês que vem, cá estaremos novamente na segunda terça-feira do mês para tratar de outro tema. Muito obrigado pela vossa presença.